Brief disclaimer for this episode, we'll record a US election special Part 1 und Part 2, so the next 2 episodes in English. And for German listeners, wir werden diese und nächste Episode als US-Spezial zu den Wahlen der Präsidentschaft in 2024 in Englisch aufnehmen und kehren danach wieder zu unserem normalen Format in Deutsch zurück.
Des Pudels Kern, der Podcast.
Hello and a very warm welcome to this very special episode of Des Pudels Kern, our usually German-speaking podcast on socio-economic topics. This is the first part of a 2-part US election special that we're doing coming up for the presidential election in 2024. My name is Philipp. I have a background in computer science and automotive engineering. I'm speaking to you from Stuttgart, and I'm quite excited for this episode.
Yes, welcome actually to this first English or English-speaking episode. I'm really excited. Marko Tokic is my name. I'm calling in from London, an economic historian, which might not particularly at first moment sound like something that's related to US elections, but trust me, friends, it really is.
Very exciting episode indeed, and probably quite unfamiliar for many of our old listeners who are just used to our German voices, but yeah, like me actually, Leo Mengel, I'm a political economist and currently based in Chicago. So it's actually my fault really making our lives much harder in terms of coordination and time difference right now. But, yeah, excited to team up for the first episode in English. Actually, I think it's the same for you, but I've been approached by so many friends and colleagues in Italy and the UK. Can we not at some point make like an English episode and basically extend the base of our podcast? So here it is, finally live and in English.
Yeah, very exciting indeed. And as you said, Leo, quite difference between the European and American coordination of this podcast. We're here in pitch black darkness in Europe, whereas your room looks quite like a cathedral down in Chicago at university. So very impressive indeed. And our introduction is today concerned with curious US election stories, because I think the past few years of US election history have been quite tumultuous and momentous for many of us, especially for those that have experienced US elections as we have, probably for the first time, probably in 2016, maybe in 2012. But looking back at the history of the USA, it isn't all that surprising that the elections are indeed quite curious. The first one was held in 1788, but perhaps the best and probably for me the most interesting story about weird things that happened at US elections goes back to Arthur Sears Henning, a Chicago Tribune correspondent in Washington. And he was sort of one of the earliest super forecasters that correctly predicted all elections from 1928 to 1948. 48 was the last one. He didn't quite get this right. And he wrote for the Chicago Tribune. And the Chicago Tribune, in the year before the election in 1947, the 48 election was between Truman, a Democrat, versus Dewey, a Republican. And Henning, obviously, as the Washington correspondent, was closely following this matchup. But the Tribune changed their printing method a year before the election, meaning that the copy that had to be sent to the printers and the printing machines had to arrive much earlier than usual because they did some changes in the lettering and whatnot. And apparently Henning wasn't quite aware of this change, and he was sort of surprised that he had to hand in his copy for the election night report. So basically after the votes had been cast, and they usually had been counted as well, leading to the situation that the thing he submitted actually didn't contain the actual winner of the election. He wrote in big letters, all caps on the front page, Dewey defeats Truman. And as we all know, Dewey never was president in the US. It was actually Harold Truman that made it in the end, leading to a famous picture that was taken of Harry Truman a few days later, I think in Chicago as well, where he has this newspaper in his hands and sort of says, hey, I'm the actual winner of the election. And I think basically two things can be learned from this story. The first one is that predictions and forecasts, and Henning was the one that actually said Dewey is most likely to win in this election night, despite not having the full information on votes being cast, can never be fully trusted, right? We have a lot of polls and predictions that we also will be discussing in this episode today. And I think it's important to just go back a step and say there's always a margin of error and put things into perspective. Not every poll is as good as it seems. And the second is that this was perhaps the first occurrence of what we currently know as fake news, because the newspapers clearly did print a thing that wasn't quite true, at least for the first iteration of the copies. And yeah, so maybe the Trump saga of fake news that was ushered in 2016 goes back a bit longer than we actually expected. And in the vein of curious things happening at elections, my first question is to you, Leo, being now in Chicago for, I think, 2 weeks or so, having been there. Was there anything weird or anything curious that happened to you in political terms already coming up through this election?
That's actually a very good question. And I'm very sorry to let you down on that, but indeed not. Like, I think it's quite calm in terms of the election. So also if you drive through the city, you wouldn't see many, like posters, banderoles of election reference, basically. Actually, there's more reference to Halloween these days than to the US election, which is barely in 3 weeks, actually. I think this might be due to the fact that here in Illinois, it's not one of these battlefield states. So we got to come to this later when we discuss the role of swing states here in the US electoral system. So I think this might be one reason, like if you would go to Michigan, for example, or to Ohio, you would see much more political campaigning out there.
I think that's kind of actually exciting in a way, because, I mean, back home where we are from, basically get terrorized all the time with election posters, no matter whether there are elections or not. And then you're suddenly in a place where at least people say something important is happening and nothing is really happening. So I would say actually maybe it's something we could learn from in one way or the other.
Yeah, we should spend more money on TV ads than posters. Perhaps that's the way to go. I think that's the US way, at least in most cases. But you mentioned it already. Let's talk a bit about how the US electoral system actually works, because I think before we go into candidates and policies, which we'll do later in this episode, let's just set the ground and explain how the US actually elect its president.
Basically, like, to take a step back, how does the whole system work at the end of the day is you have something called the Electoral College. So basically, that's like let's call it the body of the United States that elects a president and a vice president every 4 years. And it consists of 538 people who are sent in by these 50 states and the federal district as part of these presidential elections. And the number of electors you have basically as a state, let's assume Illinois, is based on the number of a state's congressional members. So the United States, like many other countries, has 2 chambers within the parliamentary system, the so-called Congress, the Senate on the one hand, and the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is a bit like the House of Commons in the UK or the Bundestag in Germany. Basically, it's like 435 people who are elected by citizens, and they're roughly given out across these 50 states, but the number you get as a state depends on the number of people you have in, more or less. The Senate, on the other hand, is very different. So the Senate is much smaller, with only 100 people, 2 per state, and that's completely regardless of the size. So if you're Alaska, which is big in size but small when it comes to the number of people living in it, you actually get the same number of seats as Texas or California, which are really big. And different to, let's say, these upper chambers like the House of Lords, the similarities end here. So unlike the Bundesrat or the Senate, members actually are directly elected by voters and serve for a rather long term, and they have way more power. So basically you have 2 chambers with relatively broad powers, and then on these people, basically, like when you add them more or less up, you get something called the Electoral College. And these people then vote more or less for the president and the vice president. So basically what you vote for here is a full package of things. But as you said, it's not about what every individual person decides. It's not proportional, but you take a specific area. So usually a state. There are actually 2 exceptions. And basically what the most common there, more or less, choice is, these people, this state more or less belongs to that party. And that leads to a very similar system like in the UK, which is split up into smaller areas. But basically that you have actually 2 large parties fighting each other over a limited number of states in that case, not constituencies. And that's where we are today.
Yeah, and interestingly, the Senate is elected on a rolling basis. So every 2 years, which means basically once between presidential elections, because they're every 4 years, the Senate is a third of the Senate is elected once again by the electorate. So we have sort of a rolling process leading to a quite significant political change potentially within one presidency, which is also quite unusual, I'd say, in global terms, that you sort of get a rolling majority in one of the chambers. That's mostly set in like Bundestag or House of Lords comparisons that are not really being elected by the electorate.
Exactly. So, I mean, at the end of the day, the US electoral system has just grown and developed, over a bunch of years, right? So, or even centuries, in fact, since the Declaration of Independence, if you want. And this makes it not only quite hard to explain to somebody who's not familiar with it, but most importantly, it also makes it quite hard to actually predict what is the outcome of a given election here. So what is very popular in Germany or in Italy, basically to look at the national vote, right? So how many people voted for Trump? How many people voted for Joe Biden in the past election, for example? And this is many times indicative of the final result, but it is not how this system actually works. So, for example, over the past 2 elections, actually, it was always the Democrats, being Joe Biden and also Hillary Clinton, also before with Barack Obama, winning the national vote, basically. And still through this system of vote bans, basically, Donald Trump is able to get into office. And this is quite unique and is making a hard time also for pollsters. So people actually trying to predict who's going to be the next president. And actually, let's talk about this, like coming to the more up-to-date situation. Like how is Kamala Harris standing in terms of the polls, especially compared to Trump in the battleground states?
Yeah, so just to start with, so basically what this means, what you've said, is that you can actually lose the election despite having more votes. And that actually happened, for example, in 2000 in the presidential elections. Al Gore, a Democrat, lost against George Bush Jr., despite having more votes, because he didn't have enough seats. Because that is, as we said, not exactly indicative of it. So he had 500,000 roughly voters more, but 5 seats less. And in the end, he would lose out on the presidential election. And as you said, I mean, there are 2 ways to look at it. Either you go with the pollsters, who then create a relatively complex method actually to evaluate who's standing where and what states are you likely going to win. When we follow that, we actually see kind of a coin flip situation. So it's relatively close. Kamala Harris in some is leading, in some it's really, really tight. So overall, the pollsters don't say much, but there is an alternative. And those are the betting markets. So basically, the logic is you put your money there where your mouth is. So people will put the money to candidates who they believe will win. And in those, it seems like as if Donald Trump is actually in the lead. So quite telling that maybe Donald Trump in many ways is unconventional, not only in the way how he produces politics, how he produces campaigns, maybe it's also the perception and the way voting and polling works when you have Donald Trump involved.
I think the fascinating thing this year is that basically every single swing state and the overall election as well are all well within the margin of error of the predictions, right? So we actually do not know a lot from the statistics that have been come up with by all the pollsters about the outcome of the election. So it's up for grabs for both of them. It's basically 50-50 if Kamala Harris gaining a lot, obviously, compared to Joe Biden as well, who was quite behind in the polls when he was still running in July this year. But most of the polls have it at, a 10-seat difference perhaps between the 2 of them. And most of them put Kamala Harris at the front right now.
Well, and actually thinking back to the first election of Donald Trump, this also created, I think, one of the most catastrophic moments for many pollsters and a whole crisis for this profession, right? Because he was actually elected into office with nobody actually predicting this, which was at this time due to the fact that you had many Republican voters not being willing to conceal their true voting intention. And I think this has changed now. So first of all, methods have improved to really cater for this biasness, how we economists would call it. But also Trump voters are more outspoken about their voting intention. And notably, there's one interesting figure in the pollster game who is Nate Silver. He is basically also a graduate from University of Chicago, where I am right now, and also LSE, and he has quite an interesting career. So founder of 5038, which was basically a platform where they pioneered data-driven political analysis. So he actually started with sports analysis. So not betting, but analyzing baseball games and predicting the outcome. And these big data approach he basically used for the US election, and he has been right quite many times. So he's one of the most famous pollsters out there. And even though he didn't predict a Trump win like all the others, he was still the one actually predicting the highest probability for Trump to win, which he's quite renowned for also today. And for this Harris-Trump election, he actually says that the odds are super narrow. So he says he's never seen an election for which the forecast spends so much time on the vicinity of 50-50. So he's currently predicting Kamala to win 50.1 to 49.7. So we're talking about 0.4 basically percentage points, which is nothing. But still, what I find really interesting is also the momentum. So basically the trajectory, and this is clearly not on Harris' side right now. She has actually had quite a comfortable margin to Donald Trump by the time of July 21st, when Biden dropped out. This has shrunken, and the NBC actually sees her even with Donald Trump in the meantime.
Yeah, what I find always fascinating is this kind of concealing who you vote for or not. So in Austria, we had that actually already in the 1990s with the rise of Jörg Haider, who was a right-wing populist. Actually was phenomenal. So pollsters had massive issues to estimate him correctly. And it took really years and years of constantly underestimating him. And nowadays we have actually the flip side of it. So people actually over-report that they vote for right-wing parties, which sounds even more absurd when you think about it. But there seems to be some sort of normalization process. And I sometimes have the feeling something similar is happening with Donald Trump voters as well. They were kind of ashamed to vote for this populism or whatever move you want to make out of Trumpism, and actually now declare, and maybe they do also over-declare. I could see that happening as well. He's, for me, one of the most unpredictable humans I could imagine, in lots of ways, including his own followers.
Yeah, and talking about sort of the electoral coalitions that are being formed by the two parties, the Democrats and Republicans, that is also something that has changed quite a lot over the last 25, but especially over the last 10 years in the end. If you look back at the historic Clinton election, the first one, that was the one that actually sort of redefined the map of America in terms of who votes Democrat, who votes Republican. And in the end, the swing states that we saw back then are sort of the swing state, and then following elections to that, because I think Clinton had 22 swing states. So he basically flipped half of the US into the other voting direction, which is fascinating at the end of the 90s. And since then, basically, the Democratic strongholds have been the Democratic strongholds and the Republican strongholds have been Republican. And you usually have 5 to 7 swing states, meaning elections in which the electoral vote that is out there is actually too narrow to call, basically, before the election. That's I'd say the easiest definition of a swing state. And what we find right now is that on the overall electoral vote, in the end, sort of 42 to 45% of voters in each camp are set. They're basically the base voters of Kamala or Donald Trump, and you can't really change their mind, nor should you try to, because they're basically guaranteed voters for you. Both candidates fight for the remaining 4 to 5% to get to the 50% of the overall vote. And what comes on top, that is 4 to 5% usually sits within the states that are swing states. So that's why we're seeing a quite concentrated campaign. And that's probably also why we're seeing what Leo described, a mild campaign in states like Illinois, which are basically set for Democrat right now.
Yeah, I think one important fact to keep in mind is that the US is heavily segregated and fragmented in terms of voting support. And this is along regional lines where you do have these, set states like the Blue Wall, for example, which used to be Democrat or Republican leaning states, but also in terms of the voters actually. So you really have huge differences regarding which minority, which social group, which gender you look at. So for example, there's a massive gender gap right now of 14 percentage points between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And also, if you look at minorities, actually one of the biggest worries for the Harris campaign right now is that she's losing quite a lot in the Latino community. So basically 54 currently percent of the Latino community supports Harris compared to 40% for Donald Trump. But this is significantly lower than harsh Democratic candidates. And another community where she's really struggling at, and these are going to be decisive communities for the election, is the Arab American community, where her and Biden's support for Israel and Gaza is basically like a hindrance to actually cast their vote in general. And then I guess there are the more set voter groups, like among black voters, young voters, white voters with a college degree. Actually also she has like a comfortable lead, but if you look at the flip side, Donald Trump, of course, he leads by a very huge margin when you look at rural voters from these states in the center of the US, as well as generally white voters like without a college degree. So this is actually going to be the challenge for the remaining 3 weeks, to mobilize these groups. And really you should go to these battleground states and every day have like an event, and just handshaking at the end makes a big difference. Just being present there in Ohio, Michigan, Florida, and so on.
And it's actually fascinating even to see how long-term and short-term then reactions happen based on that. So when you look a bit further into history, actually the Democrats are not the party of the bourgeoisie in a way. So they're not the party of the upper class, of the educated, of the college graduates. They're actually the party of the working class. And it's really interesting that where Trump really gains his voters is actually among the working class, especially the white working class. But this actually starts even to shift in the other groups as well. So black working class, Latino working class. He really manages to create some sort of working class movement, which is totally opposite to that where his party originally comes from. My personal hypothesis on that, and it's definitely not scientific at all, is that this started a bit already with the Tea Party campaign years ago, and Sarah Palin, which was a complete mess, but it just created this kind of fertile soil for this. But maybe more interesting now for this election is actually the short term. So you're talking of Arab American voters, and you can actually see now a shift as well. So that basically the US is pressuring Israel into providing more humanitarian help into Gaza. I mean, there are multiple reasons why they do this. Yes, absolutely. But the fact that the elections are coming up in a very, very short amount of time certainly plays an important role in this.
But the switch around of party affiliation on sort of socioeconomic levels of wealth, I think that's more of a global phenomenon. One could argue that the US started this all in 2016 with the first US presidential election for Trump, but maybe it was also a bit the other way around, that the world influenced the US, and in a way it seldom does, but perhaps in this case it did. And if we look back at the UK election, which we also did a podcast in German about back in July, I think, basically the same thing happened, right? Labour Party, usually known for being working class and for the workers, is now the party of the educated elite, and the Tories have become the party of the blue-collar workers. So I think the switch around, which we're also seeing in Germany and Austria, basically everywhere in the world, that seems to be a trend that is to stay at least for the next few years. One word on campaigning strategy, and then I think we'll switch to the protagonists actually and talk about Kamala Harris and Donald Trump a bit more. Interestingly, Kamala Harris's team has decided to actually not do the thing that Leo recommended, and that is going to battle states in the last 4 weeks or so. She's mainly focusing on the on turning out voters in her core electoral coalition that are perhaps unsure to vote. So young women, for example, she did a lot of podcasts, I think, in the last week in a format that is mostly listened to by younger women. And she's sort of not doing the Trump approach, whereas he is actually going into the battle states and trying to ring the bells and have some weird speeches up there with the electorate and gain some attention. But I don't know. We'll see what this campaigning differences makes in the end in the election night. But this doesn't look too promising from a sort of objective perspective for Kamala Harris, to be honest. But yeah, I said we talked a lot about the strategies now. Let's talk about the candidates. Who wants to start with Donald Trump in a brief description of who that guy actually is and what we know about him?
Well, I'm not sure whether we actually need a description of Donald Trump. I think in the meantime, most of our listeners are quite familiar and able to categorize this orange creature. Regarding this election, I think what is really to be observed is the way it's different to the past election, right? So if you look at 2016, let's be honest, Donald Trump was not prepared for the presidential election, and nor was his campaign or his whole staff. So basically, that is the reason, like, he surrounded himself still with experts in the relevant field. So basically, his ministers, they were still highly regarded Republican figures. This in this election has changed. So the Trump campaign and the Trump staff is way more focused. They know exactly what they want to do, which is basically implementing their vision of a more isolationist and authoritarian America. Basically, the key term in this regard is the Project 2025 by the National Heritage Foundation. So a heavily right-leaning Republican think tank, basically, who worked out a concept note on how to basically reform ministries and really the heart of the American administration to cater it more towards Republican policies, basically. So this would actually change the root of U.S. democracy. And then, well, of course, Trump is going to apply a much more focused and isolationist stand that he compared to what he did before even. So I guess, Marco, do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes have my doubts when it comes to focus and Donald Trump, and I have the feeling with age it's getting rather worse. I mean, the number of blunders and blips he has given in the past couple of weeks is actually, even for Donald Trump dimensions, astonishing. I mean, he was mentioning that immigrants were eating cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio, in the midst of a TV debate, which was incredibly embarrassing. And he's surrounded still by people who are anything but professional. I mean, I'm thinking of people like Laura Loomer. For most people won't know her, but a short story. Basically, she's like a right-wing ex-Twitterista, but got banned there for being too extreme. She's kind of a right-wing influencer with views that are bizarre. I mean, there's not much actually space there, and he's still surrounded by these kind of people. So I'm really not convinced how focused and how policy-oriented he really is when it comes to the reality. I think more interesting is the fact that the people he's surrounded with when it comes to business terms are very actually serious and big people. So we talk of hedge fund leaders, high investment bankers, people who were actually in policy in and out. It's very different in this regard. So he definitely has the support from big business, especially because of tax cuts he proposed. He has the support of Elon Musk, which plays a large role on Twitter. And Elon Musk annoys us with his Donald Trump ads every single day. Every Twitter user knows this. But I still see some fascinating unprofessionalism. And the peak of that was the choice of his running mate. So the running mate is the vice presidency candidate. We all expected some kind of, slightly softer solution, somebody who could appeal to a broader base of voters. And then his sons, according to stories at least, come up with J.D. Vance, who's anything but easy to keep, liberal, soft, and appealing to large voter bases. That's everything that J.D. Vance is not. So I really have high doubts on the professionalism of the Trump campaign.
But I think that's sort of the Trump effect, right? You take things into ridicule, and in the end, it turns out as a big ad for you. I mean, the pet eating stuff in Arizona, I think it was, or Ohio.
Ohio, yeah.
This has been a major meme for the Trump campaign, and has brought so much attention to Trump and his persona. Probably not to his policies, but it perhaps also did turn out voters that probably weren't thinking about voting both for Harris and for Trump in the end. So I think this is the sort of Trump factor that we also have to calculate. Yes, it looks unprofessional. It probably is unprofessional in the end, but it's sort of working in a weird way and sort of appealing to a lot of people. And the second thing I'd like to add is that I agree with your assessment that he's probably not more focused than last time, but he's certainly more open to advice from the outside. That's what Leo mentioned. Like, the staff around him is much more prepared to give him advice on things. And I believe the pet eating stuff actually did come from Laura, whatever her name is.
Laura Loomer.
The advisory he has. And I think that's interesting because in the first campaign, he sort of made it up on the go, the things he wanted to do in his presidency and in his campaign. And this right now looks a lot more steered, albeit in the sort of weird and unpredictable fashion of his persona.
Well, I think we shouldn't make the mistake and call it unprofessional fully in 2016. He still had these radical right mentors, campaign managers. I'm thinking about Steve Bannon, for example, who dropped out in the meantime. I would say, however, that the whole election machine is better oiled right now, and I think it is just a bigger machine. So he really selected the people more carefully, and I would even say including J.D. Vance. So Marco, in contrast to your argument, I think J.D. Vance is a more moderate, mild character. Well, hard to be a more extrovert figure than Donald Trump, but if you actually watched the vice presidency debate, he seemed to be really not this Rottweiler anymore, but more of a really pleasing, political figure. This kind of, a political figure that really speaks to your Republican conservative values, but on the other hand is not as repulsive as Donald Trump. And most importantly, he is actually from Ohio. So this is actually a technical pick. He used to be a senator there. Ohio, remember, is one of the crucial swing states. So the American says whoever wins Ohio wins the presidency. And in this regard, you could rather criticize Vice President Harris right now for basically selecting Tim Walz, which is the governor of Minnesota, which basically is not one of these key battleground states, like, for example, Ohio. But I guess in another point, you're quite right that Donald Trump is actually addressing important groups this election. Like you mentioned, for example, the Wall Street. I'm not so sure whether they are unisono rallying behind Trump, because at the end, Wall Street money likes inertia. So they dislike everything which comes with international trade disruption, with whatever, political tensions. But then on the other hand, with his tax advantages, of course, he's really speaking to these people. And another very important group are actually the ones holding cryptocurrencies. This is something completely underestimated in Europe, but in the US, this is a huge base, and they applaud Donald Trump continuously for his statements of liberalizing cryptocurrencies.
Indeed, but you mentioned Kamala Harris already, so let's talk about her a bit, because I think that's quite a different background compared to the Trump story of the last 10 years or so. Kamala Harris is from California, born and raised there, was a district attorney, so a long career in law before she actually came into politics. I think elected to the Senate in 2014 or 16, can't quite remember, but in the mid of the 10s. So actively in our federal level politics since the mid of the 2010s. First black woman in the Senate. I think it's something to point out, and obviously also the first black woman in the vice presidency right now. Vice president under Joe Biden for the last 4 years, which sort of is becoming a problem for her from a storytelling perspective, because all the things she's now promising to do, she theoretically could have done as vice president, but didn't. It's sort of a weak story to tell the electorate. And Joe Biden became untenable somewhere in July because of his age in the end and his decreasing capacity to actually understand things and articulate things properly on TV and in front of live audiences. That might be different than private, but certainly what we've seen from him was very worrying. And she replaced, somewhat surprisingly, to be honest, Joe Biden as the candidate for this election without any opponents on the Democratic nomination side. And campaign obviously is quite a bit shorter than the Trump campaign, because he only had 4 months in the end to do something and build a strong campaign around her. Whereas Trump, I think, has been nominated for, 9, 10, 12 months, basically a year. So it had longer to prepare this all. And she's now in a position where her key electorate is not fleeing her vote, but she definitely has problems to keep it. And the voters that actually Trump is fighting about are probably slightly out of her range from a policy perspective.
Yeah, I mean, Kamala Harris's background is really interesting. I mean, her dad is actually an economist, did his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, is originally from Jamaica, and was like a very actually big economist in his field. So he was more of an applied development economist, so something more for Leo. Her mum was also a researcher, so she comes really from a high educational, really upper class in this regard background. So interesting to see this kind of very different approach to Donald Trump, who comes from a rich background, but maybe not so clear on this educational side. She comes more from this like nomenclatura from the intellectual perspective, at least. Even more interesting, in my opinion, is her running mate, somebody called Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, as you correctly said, Leah. He has actually a very interesting career. So he was a teacher. Among other things, he actually taught for a year in China, in Guangdong. And after that, listed into military service. And I guess this actually gives you already kind of an indication why she picked him for. So on the one hand, he's very soft-spoken. He actually really takes white working class voters in a nice way with his relatively humble background, humble raising, a career that people could really relate to, and really tried then to broaden her base. So if on the one hand, Kamala Harris, who has this very successful law career, was actually considered as a compatible as a hardliner, which is unusual maybe in the first moment, but makes sense to appeal for a broader base. And then you have Tim Walz for the rest. At least that was the theory.
Yeah, but let me actually point out one thing, because be it Donald Trump or Kamala Harris being elected into office in 3 weeks, I think it's also important to get our head around the fact that there are some things that are going to change, and there are other things that are not going to change. Whoever candidate is going to get elected, basically. Among, in my opinion, things that are not going to change is, for example, be it Kamala Harris or be it Donald Trump, the protectionist economic policy of the US, right? So this has started with Trump's tariffs on China, for example, like these, I think, 4 or 5 step tariffs. This has actually accumulated even among Democrats, with the Inflation Reduction Act. Remember, like these local content requirements on like basically products produced in, they call it foreign entities of concern. This is another thing which is not going to change. And of course, the hawkishness towards China, I predict, is also not going to make a difference, like whoever is going to be president. What is actually way more interesting are the things that are going to change, like across the candidates. And I think one thing where Kamala Harris, for example, is placing a much higher focus on is, for example, international action to climate change. And certainly it's also the relation to Europe in general, for which the election matters a lot, because Donald Trump, as we all know, is way more disaligned with European policymakers in terms of Ukraine questions of NATO, for example. And I think this is something which is going to be determining for us European voters or European people a lot. So I think personally, you cannot really discard all of Trump's foreign policy. So he did some good things including, for example, the Abraham Accords in the Middle East, where he actually realigned like Israel with other Middle Eastern countries. So basically, you cannot say that everything he did is wrong, but especially with respect to Europe, like these tensions are obvious. And I would be curious about your opinion. How do you see like his election, his potential election, being a threat for the European Union or NATO in general?
So I'll only give a short answer today, actually, because our next episode, which is a second US election special, will be mostly on foreign policy. So I'll try to be as brief as possible. And the short answer is, I don't think that much will change. In reality, I don't believe when we have these like calls that big things are going to happen. Usually the catastrophes come without a call in advance. So I'm more skeptic towards that, how much they can change and how much candidates are willing to change in terms of foreign policy. But we'll come later back to economic policy, and I think they differ there actually quite significantly.
Yeah, let's take this and take a look at the inner sort of US situation of the election, because in the end, whilst Europe is an important point for us as the sort of recipients of US aid in many cases and US support, it's probably not the heart of the concern of the US American voter, because obviously there's quite a geographic difference between the two sort of entities. And yeah, in the end, no European votes in this election. So let's take a look at the internal stuff. And I think what Marco pointed out, the differences in the economic policy internally are quite extraordinary between these two candidates. Broadly framed, Trump is perceived to be as very pro-business and open to the current approach that business has, and actually brings quite a lot of idleness and stability to the inner workings of the US economics, in the sense that he doesn't want to change a lot of the frameworks. Whereas Kamala Harris and her team, in the end, strongly support the approaches that have been taken by Linda Khan, who is currently handling the Federal Trade Commission in the US. Federal Trade Commission, famous for acting against monopolies in the US economy. And her approaches to perhaps or perhaps not, we don't really know, because there hasn't been a real approach made in the legal sense, to consider the problem of high-tech monopoly accumulation that we have in the US right now is definitely threatening some of the bigger players in the market, I'd say, at least in a short-term perspective. We can't really talk about the long-term. But it becomes a lot more, I'd say, uncomfortable for big businesses with the current perspective, at least of the Harris campaign that we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, and I think among American voters, this is actually the biggest attack on Kamala Harris, usually, that she's lacking like economic skills in a sense that she has a background in law. So she was a human rights, I think, lawyer. Prior to actually joining or coming into politics, but like her foundation in economic questions in general is not as strong. You could doubt whether it is for Donald Trump, but this is certainly like the biggest problem, like basically for the Harris campaign right now, especially because economy matters. So there's this old saying, it's the economy, stupid. Which basically means that when it comes to campaign topics, at the end is not so much about foreign policy, it's about local economic questions for the everyday situations for, the John Doe of the US. And what is really surprising is that there is a huge disalignment between like how people actually feel, perceive the economy, and how the economy actually is. Because if you look at all economic indicators, in contrast to European countries like Italy, France, the UK, or Germany, they are really good in the US. So inflation, for example, has plunged from 2022 peak, so is down to 2.4% roughly. Real wages have been increasing since last year. Productivity way outperforms other OECD countries. So in Germany, in Europe, we would be happy to have a productivity like observed in the US. Unemployment rate fell back to 4.1%, which is a historical low. So all these indicators point into the right direction, though American Republican-leaning voters do not perceive them as such. And that is actually also my question to you guys. What do you think is the explanation for this phenomenon?
I follow actually a lovely newsletter on that, the Unhedged newsletter of the Financial Times, written by Rob Armstrong and Aidan Reiter. And there's actually a lovely explanation for that, which is quite simple, but it makes sense. At the end of the day, you had this inflationary shock. So things got more expensive, and people do not think really in terms of, is now, let's say, this rate of price increases going down, or is it more that price levels are still high? Things still feel expensive. The US, for example, has a massive tipping crisis. So tips actually exploded during COVID and afterwards. This doesn't come back. So prices do not fall after an inflationary shock. So maybe this, let's say, unhappiness really stems from this kind of logic that you have really, it's more about the level of prices really than the actually increase in prices. And that would make sense in one way or the other, because that's what people see when they go to supermarkets. The fact that they earn more might not actually counter this kind of psychological effect. And there's research on it. This effect exists, and it is very, very real. Another, just to add small detail, Kamala Harris is actually not a human rights lawyer, she's a criminal lawyer.
But I think the thinking of simple explanations is the right one, because in the end, a minority of the voters are actually economists, and the minority of the voters actually can sort of put it into perspective. And if you look at it at a very high level, it's quite easy really, because the Trump presidency until 2020 was more or less in the same time frame as a strong economy, right? An economy where the US people didn't really have problems. There wasn't big inflation or any sort of indicators that would worry the day-to-day American. Maybe economists were slightly worried, but surely not people on the ground, basically. And then came Joe Biden, and he didn't really do a lot for internal economics apart from the IRA, the big sort of more or less pointing to the foreign economic policy side of things, protectionism start. And things got worse with him. Like, there wasn't really an improvement over the 4 years for the standard American when it comes to prices in these 4 years of Biden presidency. And I think if you're a voter and you don't really know what inflation is, and I think that's basically the majority of the voters, right? You just see prices going up. Prices did go up when Biden was president, so it must be that the Democrats don't really have economic knowledge. And I think really that's basically all of it. Nobody's really thinking about this more deeply.
Exactly. So you do have these anchoring heuristics basically from voters, which do not take into account all economic information, if you want, but they have gone through this period of substantially increased inflation. Hence, the Democrats are not pursuing a good economic policy. That's true. I think another explanation for it is, again, these regional disparities. So if we're talking about all these statistics, they are aggregated across the US basically. But if you look at these states of the Rust Belt, for example, that Trump won proportionally in the last election, so we're talking Michigan, we're talking Minnesota, for example, all these Rust Belt states, they have been actually shifting to Trump, as we said before. And this is mostly because basically they were disadvantaged by all these phenomena happening over the last 20 years related to globalization. So there are some huge discrepancies in the US of who were the people, the regions winning and profiting from globalization. For example, the West Coast, right? We're talking California, of course, or also the capitals and the metropolis in the East Coast. But then you had these socially deprived regions where people just didn't profit, and actually reallocation, for example, of employment happened, right? With the arrival of all these Chinese imports, basically at the beginning of the 2000s, with automation, for example, in these huge car industries. So, for example, Detroit used to be a flourishing city, in terms of the car industry. They still have car industry, but there has been a lot of replacement. And I think this creates grievances which actually map onto Donald Trump support. And in fact, there is academic research about it. David Autor, an MIT scholar, with others, have actually analyzed this, and they really trace it down to Chinese imports being, well, like disproportionately high in these regions, basically, that have voted for Trump and brought him into office. So in a way, like Trump's narrative, the jobs are taken away, it is true for these regions. And I think this is a non-negligible fact, basically, and it helps for understanding the phenomenon of populism, at least in the US, but also in Europe. We have similar evidence, basically, for these left-behind regions in Europe continentally, but also in the UK by Italo Colantone, a scholar from Bocconi University, for example.
But I'll play devil's advocate here and say that the policies of the Democratic Party make things rather worse than better. And Donald Trump is actually on the same boat with making these mistakes. So there's been actually now a big discussion about the Japanese company taking over US Steel. So US Steel, as its name says, it's the US largest steel producer, and it's like a monolith, I would say, in this kind of US landscape. And probably what makes them interesting, they also produce steel that is used for defense purposes, and it has government contract. Still, let us be honest, this is a normal producing company, like many others in the US. And now we get to this bizarre situation that you get an outside investor. So if a US investor goes somewhere abroad and does it, that'll be completely fine. But now the Democrats, as well as actually Donald Trump, block the idea that the Japanese company could take over a US company and actually improve it. Because the comment from US Steel is, if this does not happen, we're closing the factories. So I'm sometimes not sure in this kind of story between, we don't let foreign influence coming in, and at the same time we're saving the jobs. I think we should be more honest about this and also point towards certain mistakes that make things rather worse than better. I mean, certainly imports play a role, and the producing industry in the US has been negatively impacted by that. But I would say policy sometimes does not make things better.
Yeah, but if we talk about policy in this regard, I think it's interesting that we don't know for sure, but perhaps in the long term, the Biden IRA thing, where he actually sort of tries to insource lots of things that have been imported over the last 20 years into the US, will actually generate jobs at some point for exactly the people that Leo mentioned that are sort of being lost right now with globalization going back. So this could help them in the long run, but it certainly won't take effect until this election, because it's sort of a much longer process to actually get these jobs into the reality and to actually build the structures that need it. So not quite sure if the policies really matter in a sense, because nobody knows the policies from the voters in detail. Like, too many people are not interested in this stuff. And B, you can't really see a direct impact right now on many people's lives. So things that will pay off in 10, 20 years, perhaps, we don't really know. But the chance of these paying off, they are not really relevant to voters right now. So I think that's the biggest discrepancy between what the parties promised and what the voters expect.
Yeah, I think at the very end, we all agree that you have these social and regional discrepancies in the US that are actually just supported by also like the media and the very fragmented news basically the people are consuming through platforms like X, Facebook. And I think actually this is a topic we should also talk about in the next second episode on the US, polarization, social polarization in general in the US. But since we have actually started our episode with some of the polls, I would like to ask the following question, because I came across a poll which I found interesting but really worrying at the same time. Which was actually from the Marist National poll conducted in May 2024. And they asked the Americans how they would actually judge the likelihood of another US civil war happening in their lifetime. And there were 47%, so almost 50% of US Americans stating that this likelihood is actually high. So higher for Republicans than for Democrats or independents. But what is your opinion on that? What is the real probability that we could end up in such a situation?
I'll put it that way. So I think in the short term, it doesn't sound very likely to me. I mean, I guess the Democrats learned from the mistakes from January 6th. I mean, one of the biggest mistakes was the fact that the major government buildings were not actually correctly secured in the first place. So security services definitely made a dramatic mistake. I think they learned from that. But the question is the long run. Of course, I mean, you could have civil unrest for all kinds of reasons. And the US is a melting pot in multiple ways, but a melting pot also for many, let's say, rather unfortunate influences. So I'll say the short answer, no, definitely not, actually. But the long run is the one that we should care more about here.
I'm sort of split on this in a way, because I think the incredibly short-term perspective of this is the next January 6th, basically, right? I mean, we have to confront a situation that the Trump campaign, should they lose the election, will probably not accept the outcome of this election as they did the last time around. They tried to win the presidency. So I think there's a very real risk of at least major upheaval in the population for the outcome of this election if it shouldn't go the way that mainly Trump supporters envision it, because those were the ones that last time actually took to arms and tried to storm the Capitol. And in the long run, I'm not too sure. I still have a strong institutional belief in the US, which sort of demands that the next presidency is not destroying these institutions, which they very well could. Like if a Trump or Harris campaign, probably more the Trump campaign in this case, obviously, tries to dismantle the US state in a way, and Project 2025, which you also probably will talk about in the next episode a bit more, is aiming at that direction, then I think there's a rising risk of bigger civil unrest. But if they're not able to do that sufficiently, I do not think that we will see a major change today, because the US, as Marco said, has always been a melting pot. There's always been conflict and segregation, quite literally, in the 60s, for example, and we usually didn't have complete civil war on the streets. Of course, there were sort of social upheavals, bloody upheavals as well, that lost many lives over the process. But I don't think we'll go into a flat-out civil war as we once had back in the 1800s for the US. Very well, and that's the end of our very first special episode on the US in English. Quite the experience, I'd have to say. I had to go back to my rusty English. I haven't been to the UK for quite some time, so yeah. Hopefully
you have to visit us more often.
Yeah, I have to come more to London, definitely. Yeah, I'll come by in the end of this year, probably, once again. All right, thanks again for listening to us, and have a good night or good evening or good day or whatever, and we'll catch you at the next episode with Des Pudels Kern. Thanks and goodbye.
Des Pudels Kern, der Podcast.